of hosting these monthly webinars of lively Freemasonry conversation, but most importantly, to keep them entertaining. Now, you can submit any questions to us, to our guests in the next few months via Slido, and this evening by tapping in the code Solomon Live. And our topic this evening is, what is Freemasonry? And I'm delighted to say that our very special guest this evening is the United Grand Lodge of England Grand Secretary and CEO, Dr. David Staples. How are you doing, David?
Brody, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you.
Oh, it's good to see you. And I remember when we spoke a few weeks ago, one of the things that you mentioned during this strange time, that you spend most of your time nowadays locked in your bedroom at home, feeling like you're back in the 90s with your mum popping upstairs bringing you teas on a regular basis.
It's very much like being a teenager again. There I am in my top room, looking at a screen with little pixels on, and my 89-year-old mother, who lives with my wife and small child, and I, pops up the stairs with a cup of tea and a biscuit, and it's very much deja vu.
So let's begin by featuring our topic this evening. Let's go straight to the chase. What is Freemasonry as far as you're concerned, David?
Well, to me, I'm a completely accidental Freemason. I became involved over 20 years ago when a friend of mine at university was coming back twice a term for some fantastic good events, and I knew nothing about them whatsoever. But after the third or fourth time he came back, I sort of said to him, "Where is it that you go? What is it that you do?" And he said to me, "Well, do you want to find out?" And in 20 years, I have had an enormous amount of fun. And I think that's the first thing to say. Freemasonry to me is enormous fun. I have met some fabulous people from all different backgrounds, all different races, all different classes. Went in that very first lodge as a student society, and then eventually when I came down to London via a number of other places as a junior doctor. And to me, Freemasonry is the opportunity to meet some great people who've done some fantastic things in their lives, who aren't necessarily like me, who aren't necessarily my age. They can be 20 or 30 years older or 20 or 30 years younger. And it's a way of meeting some great people, of doing some real good for the communities that we're drawn from, and having a huge amount of fun.
So that's what you think Freemasonry is. What isn't Freemasonry?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I mean, in your, I spent 2 years really trying not to talk about all of the negatives. But what Freemasonry isn't is a way of getting something for nothing. It's not about yourself and what you're going to get out of it. It's about how you build yourself as an individual. It's about taking the lessons that we learn in our ceremonies, that there are some people who are less well off than you, less fortunate than you, and it's your duty and your honor to look after them. It's about improving yourself as a human being through education, through all sorts of other means, improving your confidence, improving your ability to speak well, improving your ability to interact well with all sorts of different people who maybe you're not used to interacting with. And it's about remembering that you have but one life, and one life to use well and to be remembered for the right reasons. And so to me, when I think back on our ceremonies, it's those lessons that we're taught.
So where do you think Freemasonry went wrong all those years ago? Because it was seen now that the hard work that is being carried out is a case of we're playing catch up, aren't we?
I think we probably are. Where did it go wrong? I think we didn't talk about who we are and what we did. I think we kept things so close to our hearts and so close to our chests that we didn't let anybody in to understand anything about it whatsoever. And that's dangerous. And it's dangerous because it allows people who don't know much about us, or our detractors, to fill that void with all sorts of rubbish. And I think that rubbish then becomes accepted because it's not challenged, and it goes to become dogma and fact. And suddenly it is the opinion that's out there. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of patience and a lot of skill to try and turn that oil tanker around and portray Freemasonry for what our members know it is. Something that does a huge amount of work for charity. £48 million raised a couple of years ago, 18.5 million hours of unpaid volunteering each year. This is the real face of Freemasonry, and that's what we need to get out there and show people.
But a few years ago, it was 2018, wasn't it? Enough is Enough campaign started, and that was Freemasonry's attempt to tackle discrimination and misrepresentation. Do you think that had an effect on where we are today?
Well, I think that served two purposes. Firstly, it was drawing a line in the sand about what we wouldn't put up with anymore. And so when a award-winning national newspaper put something on the front page which said that secret lodges were stuffed full of MPs and journalists and were meeting in Westminster, and when the truth of that actually was that these lodges had been in the Times and the Telegraph when they were founded, they had their own web pages, they had Wikipedia entries, they were far from secret. They didn't have any MPs or any journalists in at all, and they met in Camden. And yet an award-winning national newspaper thought it was fine just to print that as its headline. And so the first point of doing that really was to draw a line in the sand and say, we will not put up with this anymore. There were no other group in society where people could just say whatever they wanted about them. And because of our successes in actually being a diverse organization across race, across religion, across culture, we were never going to be, fall under protected characteristic laws. We were never going to be able to say, you can't do that because it's fundamentally wrong. Free speech would always triumph. But free speech doesn't mean that people can just tell lies about us. And so the first point was to draw that line in the sand and say, enough is enough. And secondly, it was a strong and clear signal to our members as well, that our members could actually start talking about who we are and what we do. And so it, if you like, gave permission for people to start talking about those things, to not sort of look a bit awkward when somebody asks, but say to be proud of being Freemasons and to stand up for all those things that we know we do, that we thoroughly enjoy.
And can you ever see a time when you would have to do enough is enough? Can you ever see that happening again? Would you be prepared to do it again?
I think we would certainly be prepared to do it, but I hope we've moved on from there. When around 2018 or so, we knew that only 1 in 10 of the public would have considered joining us. And we knew that we weren't terribly popular. We have moved a huge way since then. Now we're into 1 in 4 of the public would think about joining us, and our net favourability is much higher than it was 2 years ago. And the reason that that's true is that we have started talking about who we are and what we do, and we've stopped answering our critics because it's very difficult to win an argument with somebody who already has a fixed negative view about you. It's much easier to talk to people who don't have fixed views and who are going to listen to reason and look at evidence and come up with their own conclusion. And we know that there's 30% of the public who know what Freemasonry is, well, or rather have heard of Freemasonry, but have no idea who it is. And it's much better for us to address that 30% than 1 or 2 crackpots who've decided that we do all sorts of nefarious things.
Let's talk about 2017 now. For any Freemason, it was a wonderful year, and a year that we will never forget. There's so many wonderful things that stand out. The Royal Albert Hall, of course, it was our centenary, but it was also the year that Inside the Freemasons came on television, and the first time that your name came into my life, David. What kind of impact did that have on the wider public and indeed Freemasons as a whole?
Well, I think, again, it said to members of UGLE that we were willing to transform the organisation from something whose policy had always been we don't comment on anything and we're not going to say anything about who we are or what we do, to allowing unfettered behind-the-scenes access for hundreds of hours of documentary makers. And it was hundreds of hours who followed people for all around the building, their lives, what they were doing professionally, to cut down to the 6 hours that made it onto Sky Television. And that's a powerful signal for an organisation to say we're willing to let somebody in and see who we are and what we do. And in terms of what it did for us, I still see that now. I still get emails and Facebook comments and things saying, "Oh, you were on telly in Canada the other night." I think we did a stint with BA, and I think I watched one of them crossing the pond for a giggle a few years ago. But it moved public perception from those who didn't really know what we were doing to a much more neutral place. I don't think it necessarily moved us on to a positive. I don't think it sort of went out there and said, here's something that you really, really want to join. And I think my job as CEO and Ground Secretary now is to really highlight some of the positives and move the dial just a little bit more towards something that we do want to join. And the board and the various different working parties of the board are absolutely focused on what is working in some of our provinces to portray that image well, and in terms of membership, what is working in order to bring people in and keep people engaged.
Now let's talk about what I often refer to as the elevator pitch, the Freemason elevator pitch, because they say, don't they, that if you was to speak to 10 Freemasons and ask them what is Freemasonry, you would probably get a different answer. I remember speaking to a Freemason years ago, way before I joined, and the way he was describing it, it was almost a cross between being a Jedi Knight and a Shakespearean actor, for example. So are we working on anything that would help us with our collective elevator pitch when describing what we do?
Well, there's been all sorts of elevator pitches over time, hasn't there? And brotherly love, relief and truth are certainly our traditional values. But when you go out to the public and you ask what they think of this, only 3% of them have any idea what we're talking about. And so the core leaflet and in our core literature now, when people ask what is Freemasonry about, we talk about integrity, respect, friendship and charity. And that's really a bringing up to date of brotherly love, relief and truth. Integrity, because you're taught to do the right thing, even in difficult circumstances. Respect goes back 3 centuries of realizing that people are people and should be equal. And we don't care where you're from. We don't care what your background is. We don't care what color your skin is. We don't care what God you worship. You are respected as an individual for your merits. Friendship, because over the many, many meetings and the many, many years, you turn that first meeting, that initiation, from a feeling of bewilderment and uncomfortableness and strangeness to lifelong friendships. And you meet some wonderful people who you remain in touch with through the years. And charity, of course, one of our raison d'etres, millions of pounds raised for charity each year. Really taking to heart that first philosophical lesson that Freemasons learned to look after those less fortunate than yourself. And so using integrity, respect, friendship and charity, they are 4 things which I would base an answer around when I was asked to say what Freemasonry was for my 30 seconds or so.
And keeping along that train of thought for a little bit, how important do you think the language that we use as Freemasons? Well, how important is it, the language that we use? Because I've often heard that many people, the general public, don't like the word masonic, for example, because it sounds very similar to demonic.
That's right. So masonic brings up in people who have not heard of who we are and what we do, demonic, satanic, all sorts of strange things, simply by word association, not because they've got any idea as to what Freemasonry is about. And so language is actually extraordinarily important. And of course, with something like Freemasonry, we have developed over the years our own internal language. And because most of our members have been members for a number of years, and people who want to join us come in and they learn that internal language, it's not threatening to them. It's not a worry to them. But it is worrying when we then go out and use that internal language to the broader public. And so, again, a lot of research has gone on to look at the language that we use when we're speaking about ourselves and the emotional response that it brings about in the listener. So, for example, when somebody says on an interview, I'm Provincial Grand Master from somewhere or other, that has a reasonably negative effect. But if you say I'm the head Freemasonry of anywhere shire, that's much more positive. Freemasonry polls much better than Masonic for the reasons that we've talked about, and engaging people, engaging our members, finding new members. These are the neutral terms which we should be using, which are non-threatening, non-worrying, and have a much better result when we speak about them publicly. And so there's a balance there, isn't there? Because what we don't want to do is turn into an organization that uses language in facile and childish and noddy ways and tries to get everybody to speak in exactly the same way and sort of turn out some sort of corporate automaton who can just come out with trite garbage, which doesn't really mean very much. But equally, we've got to follow the evidence, and we've got to stop using things which don't work. And as a doctor in my other life, you don't use things which don't work. You've got to follow the evidence, and there's a clear evidence trail as to who we are, what we do, and how we should describe ourselves.
Now, some people have said, haven't they, that UGLE, United Grand Lodge of England, of course, doesn't mean an awful lot to the general public. Are there any plans to change that in the future?
I don't think so. I think UGLE is the governing body of Freemasonry. It's their job to represent Freemasonry and, if you like, get Freemasonry known. So to get what Freemasonry is known, what it's about, what its core principles are, what Freemasons do. We're not trying to turn ourselves into Nike or Coca-Cola and UGLE become something which is instantly recognized. Freemasonry is the thing which needs to be recognized. And in this country, the United Grand Lodge of England is the only male Grand Lodge, and then there's the two female Grand Lodges, Order for Women Freemasonry and Freemasonry for Women, formerly HFAF. These are organisations which actually work very closely together in a number of different ways, and I think they would almost certainly agree that they don't want those individual things to become known. What they want to become known and understood is Freemasonry. So am I worried that UGLE isn't a brand or doesn't turn itself into something instantly recognisably? No, not particularly, but I think our job is to make sure that Freemasonry is.
Thank you, David. Now, of course, we've got people listening and viewing all over the country, Masons and non-Masons alike. So if you do have a question you would like me to put to David, Slido is where you need to go, and the code there is hashtag Solomon Live. What I thought we could do is get to some of those questions as we're going. And here's an interesting one, actually, and the ultimate question perhaps this evening. When do you think Freemasonry started, David?
Sorry, I missed that. When do I think Freemasonry?
When do you think Freemasonry started? Because we often talk about going back 300 years, but obviously Freemasonry's been around a lot longer.
Well, I think received wisdom is that it started north of the border up in, sorry, I've just got a door which keeps closing on me. Excuse me a second. There we go. I think received wisdom is it started sometime in the 12th or 13th centuries. I am not a Masonic historian. I never pretend to be. To me, Freemasonry came out of operative lodges of Masons, drawn from those who were building our great cathedrals and castles, and it fits very sensibly with the sorts of allegorical and symbolic things that we use to illustrate the philosophy that we have and that we expound during our ceremonies. Whether that's true or not, I've no idea, but it's good enough for me.
And another question, actually, how important is the deep philosophy in the ceremonies? How do they affect the members?
I think they vary very much from member to member. I think for some members, it's an absolutely fundamental part of their Freemasonry. For other members, I think they're more interested in the social aspects. They're more interested in the good dinner afterwards. And it's a deeply personal thing. To me, the key lessons that you learn, I think, are undoubtedly true. The three things that I've spoken about, there would be very few people who would argue with those. It played an absolutely fundamental role in spreading, though Freemasonry played an absolutely fundamental role in spreading those sorts of things throughout Europe in the European Enlightenment, and via Freemasonry, the sorts of things that we take for granted now in Western civilization are there. So Freemasonry was one of the very first things to allow one man, one vote. Beforehand, it was patronage, and those that could vote had to be of a very special status. But if you think back to ancient Greece, Greek civilization, ancient Roman civilization, democracy there is not like democracy now. Democracy that we have now was spread through the European Enlightenment, through lodges, through Masonry, and so we have a fabulous tale to tell. In 2023, we will be celebrating the tercentenary of the Anderson Constitutions, which were the rule book that really allowed this to really get going 300 years ago. And UGLE will be leading the world in an enormous celebration of those fundamental precepts of Freemasonry and the philosophy behind it. And so it's important to UGLE. It's important to a great many of our members, but I think a number of other members actually, you enjoy the ceremonies because they're familiar with them and they're comfortable with them. Do they understand every aspect of them? Who knows? But they certainly enjoy themselves afterwards. And I think that's fine.
Absolutely. A very good question, actually. Going back to talking about perception and what the members can do to improve the perception of Freemasons and normalise it. How can Grand Lodge encourage its members to be more open and engage with the local community more?
Well, I would like to see a time when all of our members are entirely happy to declare themselves as Freemasons. I always did, but I was never in a job where anybody would ever raise an eyebrow about that. So when I was in the hospital, I'd be in scrubs. That was my uniform, if you like, unless I was going to a Masonic do, in which case I'd be in a suit. And people would often come up to me and say, "What on earth are you in a suit for? Have you got a job interview or something?" And I'd say, "No, I'm a Freemason." And 9 out of 10 of them would be interested, and they'd ask me a few questions about it. And every now and then you get one who you'd see their buttocks clench and their eyes sort of widen, and they'd shoot off in the opposite direction as fast as they possibly could. And you didn't have terribly much of a conversation with them. But I think just, as with so many things, it's so important not to force things down people's throats. If they want to talk about it, let them talk about it and talk openly about it. There's nothing to be ashamed of. We have done, as I say, we've got a fabulous history dating back many centuries. We have a fabulous record of things that we have done in our local communities, but also at a national level as well, through the Masonic Charitable Foundation and through the sorts of things that we support at that level, at provincial level as well. And so stick around a framework. I would use that framework of those 4 key words to talk about those 4 key points. And within 30 seconds, you've given a pretty good idea of what Freemasonry is about.
And we were talking briefly before coming on air this evening. Have you noticed that when you appear on television, when you're being interviewed on the radio, have you noticed those interviews have changed with you in recent years? Perhaps less focus on handshakes and more on...
No, absolutely. We used to have what I would call the unholy 5, which was nepotism, corruption, handshakes, women, and something else. Trouser legs. Never mentioned now. And I think we're really in a transition period, which is enormously useful. It used to be that Freemasons' stories were all about, an individual lapsed member who had done something terrible. And there are not many members like that at all, but they would come to prominence, and that would be the story. And now what we see by contrast is the Freemasons, remember them, might have been a bit iffy, but now they're doing all of this sort of stuff. And I genuinely believe that in a year or two's time, we'll be through that transition period, and it will be the Freemasons who are known for all of this good stuff. And here's something else that they've done. And that time can't come quickly enough for me, because that is the Freemasonry that I know and have loved and enjoyed over the last 2 decades or so. And I think it's everybody else's experience of it who's actually a member of a lodge. And certainly the interviews have changed significantly. Yeah.
Now, it would, of course, be remiss of us not to talk about the pandemic that we're all living through at the moment. Many of us going through a difficult period of our lives. How has the pandemic affected Freemasonry, would you say? Good or bad?
Well, I think it's got a little bit of each, really. I mean, the obviously bad thing is that for a membership organisation, we have not been able to meet for a year in the way that we used to, and the way that we enjoy, and the way that we are really looking forward to getting back to, hopefully in not too long. And that's a huge challenge. We didn't know how many people were going to stick with us. And so very early on, we did some polling and actually found out that just over 98% of our members were going to stick with us, and they were all really looking forward to getting back to it. Nobody was particularly interested in going off and doing something else instead. So that's, I mean, first of all, that's enormously heartening, because it means that our members are engaged and thoroughly enjoy what they do. But that doesn't mean, of course, that we can just rest on our laurels and do nothing and say thank you very much and you count on their support in an ongoing fashion. So we had to very much change what we were doing from an organisation which is predicated around physically meeting in a physical space to think how we might engage members not physically meeting. And Zoom meetings obviously appeared. Lots of lodges have done social evenings, pub quizzes, have kept meetings going so that they can actually see each other, talk to each other and interact. And one of the good things through that is an awful lot of people who lodges have not seen in a long time, who perhaps find it difficult to get to lodge meetings because they've moved, because they live a long way away, or perhaps because they're ill, have been able to join. And I've certainly seen people who I've not seen for a long time in a number of my lodges, and it's really nice to see them again. And I think they get something from it as well, having not been for 4 or 5 years, to suddenly see a lot of people who actually they spent a lot of time with, who they enjoyed, who they were friends with. So that's definitely a plus point. One of the other negatives, I think, is the changing sea of legislation in which we find ourselves. And as a governing body for an organisation, we have to react to the legislation. We can't react to the what's suggested the legislation might be 5 days in advance in a copy of the paper. We have to wait until the statutory instrument is actually published. And in so much of COVID, statutory instruments have been published on the day that the legislation has changed, or on the day that the guidance has changed. And so it's been quite hard work actually working out what is legal, what is wise, and what is sensible, and then getting that out in a way to people that everybody knows and understands where we're coming from. You will have seen and received First Rising, which now everybody gets in their inboxes directly from Grand Lodge, and that's carried a number of the notices that we've had to talk about. But I hope it's also carried a message of hope. It's told people what other districts are doing, where perhaps the legislation and the guidance isn't necessarily so strong. I think it has allowed people to still feel part of not just of their lodge, perhaps their province, but also realise that they're part of this other thing, Grand Lodge, United Grand Lodge of England, which perhaps we've been a little distant in the past, but we don't intend to stay distant.
And there's lessons to be learned from every organisation, every family, every person, every Freemason. What lessons do you think Freemasonry will take from this? For example, I'm speaking to you now. I never thought in a million years that I'd be sat in my office speaking to the Grand Secretary of the United Grand Lodge of England on my computer. What lessons do you think we'll take forward from all this?
Well, I think we have to be flexible enough to be able to do things differently as circumstances dictate. Now, that doesn't mean that we suddenly become flexible enough that every time anybody has a bright idea in authority, it's just immediately implemented with no forethought and with no planning and with no thought as to the consequences. But I think it's fair to say that we're expecting a very comprehensive review of the Book of Constitutions within the next few years or so, learning the lessons that we've learnt through the pandemic, and a number of other lessons along the way as well. I've wandered a little bit off track. Just remind me of that question you asked.
Lessons to be learned from, so we've all gone through a pandemic. Lots of businesses will work differently in the future. Lots of people, Freemasons. How will the United Grand Lodge of England move forward? And lessons to be learned from all of this.
Sure. I mean, there's a number of things we were doing really before the pandemic in terms of the Great Queen Street staff. The necessity to come into a building every day was already being addressed. Flexible working means that you have happier staff and you'll be able to recruit better staff. You get a much wider pool of people who you can actually recruit from. Within the wider organisation, the use of technology. We were essentially a paper-based organisation that hadn't changed in a number of decades. Project Hermes, which is sort of coming on stream at the end of this year, will save secretaries a huge amount of time in a huge number of different ways. Candidates who are in their 20s and 30s will find an organisation that they can join using a method that they would expect to join it through, namely online forms on the internet with a database which is kept up to date by their person who's actually they know and who's responsible for them, namely their lodge secretaries. So I think we were moving in the direction of some sensible, measured modernisations before the pandemic came. I think the pandemic has accelerated that aspect of the business, as it has done in all sorts of different businesses, throughout the world. But the use of meetings at distance, the use of technology, the use of the internet, picking up the phone and actually talking to people rather than relying on waiting to see them at the next meeting, all of these things, I think, are being used much more. And we will continue to use them. I don't think when normality comes, we're suddenly going to stop doing any of these things. We may do less of them, and we may thoroughly rejoice in our ability to meet as individuals in a physical space again. But I don't think that means we're going to forget about the people who haven't been coming for 3 or 4 years. I think there will be more Zoom meetings that actually include them. I think lodge mentors and lodge charity stewards have a new medium which they can use to best effect, and should do so.
Now let's talk about our younger members or future members. How do we attract them into Freemasonry? Because we're talking about what is Freemasonry, and there's lots of distractions, social media now. Some people would say it's a distraction. It's a wonderful thing. How do we encourage younger people to join the fraternity in this day and age that we all live in?
Well, I'm going to use a horrible term, and I can see people sort of spinning in their graves as I say this, but by offering a product that younger people want. And when I think of when I went in, I was only 21 or so. The product that I got was the ability to sit next to people who had fought in wars that I'd never heard of, who'd been to countries I'd never visited, who had done things that I didn't know existed, who had jobs and roles and responsibilities that I didn't know existed, who, when I became a junior doctor, were more senior doctors that I could ask advice from, not about management of patients, but about actually, how do you deal with this, and this? And you could talk about aspects in your career to them that you couldn't talk to your own consultants about or anybody else in your hospital about, because they knew you. And you didn't want to talk to them about it. But you're exposed to all these weight of experience and weight of knowledge, some completely different from me, some very similar to me, but at a very different stage in the career. And that was an extraordinary product, which I've never experienced anywhere else. I don't think you get it at a golf club or a sports team or anything where there is a particular focus on something else. Freemasonry gives everybody a shared experience. It gives them the same experience of going through that ceremony of initiation, of coming together within those lodge meetings and going through those different ceremonies. And then it gives you a completely different experience according to what you make of it. And I think that is a unique product. I think the philosophical messages that it teaches are something that society is sorely in need of. And I think with the rise of echo chamber social media and the inability to actually interact in what I would consider a normal and functional way, is something which is enormously appealing, not just to younger people, but as certainly after the pandemic, as people are thoroughly sick of talking to pixelated screens or listening to people like me talking on pixelated screens.
Well, this is all right tonight. I mean, this is good.
I think it has a fantastic product to offer, and it's about getting out in an understandable way what that is, and making people realise that they would thoroughly enjoy it.
Now, we've said already this evening, David, that we've got people viewing all over the country at the moment, maybe even all over the world, Freemasons and non-Freemasons alike. So a nice question here, is there an age limit, e.g. minimum age to be a Freemason? I think that's a nice one for us to answer, isn't it?
Well, the board have recently brought the age of initiation down to 18. We always used to initiate 18-year-olds, but they would require a special dispensation from their provincial Grand Masters. But the age of majority in this country is 18, and so it was felt sensible that we shouldn't be outside or different to that. So you have to be over 18 years of age. You certainly don't have to, there's certainly no upper limit. I've often toyed with the idea of bringing my father in, who I think is 90 next year. I better get on with that if I'm going to do it. But I've certainly known people who have been brought in their 80s and 90s, and they've thoroughly enjoyed it as well. So no, minimum age of 18, 18 to as old as you get.
Okay, now let's go back to Slido, because we've had lots of questions which I thought we would intersperse during our conversation. Seems to be working well. Back to your role, Grand Secretary, CEO of the United Grand Lodge of England. What would you say is the toughest part of your job?
Keeping the number of people who need to know about things in the loop and knowing about things. So I am the Masonic Secretary to His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent. I am the Secretary to the rulers, and I am the Secretary to the Board of General Purposes, and the Secretary to the Committee of General Purposes. And they are all different characters with different priorities and different ways of doing things. And everything that is happening within the organisation at some point comes through me, and it's my job to make sure that everybody else knows about what's happening in all the various different strands. And so I think that's probably the most challenging thing, realising what needs to go where and what can just be got on with.
And this is an interesting one, actually. I've often thought, what would I ever say to the Grand Secretary if I ever had the honour of speaking to him? Well, I guess I've got the chance to say this. When you think back to your initiation at Apollo Lodge back in the day, could you ever possibly have imagined that you would ultimately become the face of Freemasonry as CEO and Grand Secretary? Could you have ever imagined that in a million years?
I think it's very funny, isn't it, how sometimes decisions that you make have a very profound effect later on, for which you could see no possible connection at the time. It's the old butterfly wing creating a hurricane somewhere else sort of analogy. But as I was getting ready for my initiation in my student room, about 3 or 4 mile cycle away from where the Masonic Hall was that I was going to be initiated in, I can very distinctly remember going through my mind, God, can I really be bothered to put all this clobber on? And what on earth am I doing? And I don't really sure what I'm getting into. And my interview had involved going and seeing somebody in a college who told me absolutely nothing about anything, and then being told to turn up at a certain day, a certain time. And I remember thinking, I am going to do it because I told my friend I was going to do it, and I'm not going to let him down. So off I went. But it could have gone the other way, and who knows? So I think back to my initiation back in the day, and I'm extraordinarily glad that I made that decision, because I certainly would have had no clue whatsoever that I'd now be chief executive. I think at the time I didn't have a clue I was going to be a doctor. I was doing biochemistry at the time. So life moves in mysterious ways. But I've had a fantastic journey along the way, and irrespective of the position I have now, if I wasn't Grand Secretary, I would still be a very committed Freemason in Nottinghamshire, in Oxfordshire, and in the Metropolitan Grand Lodge. And I would still be meeting lots of really interesting people, and I'd still be having a huge amount of fun. And so I don't think it would have detracted from my experience at all not to have got this job. Glad I did, but no, I thoroughly enjoy it. But
I think we're glad you did as well, which is truly wonderful. Back to Slido for a second, sir, if I can. With people commuting less, becoming more local and community-minded, and a renewed interest in personal betterment, do you think a renaissance is in flow?
I do. I think that what we have done as an organisation over the last 10 to 12 months throughout the pandemic, and the way in which it has been seen by the public and appreciated by the public, has brought about a sea change in how we are perceived. You can see this in the waiting lists that are around the country for people who want to join us. In the hundreds in most provinces, which is unprecedented in recent times. Yes, of course, there's not been the standard flow through, but what we're seeing is far and above what we would expect had we had a normal year. And so I think the time is ripe for a change in perception, and for us to be able to not capitalize on it, but to be quite open and proud of who we are and what we do. times have changed, perceptions have changed, and we shouldn't be shy about recognizing that and being proud of it.
Absolutely. And Freemasonry has changed. Back in the day, of course, it was quite a regular thing to see a Freemason parading up the street, wasn't it? And at various events. And this is a wonderful question that ties along nicely with that. Are there any plans to be able to parade in regalia as Masons did before the war?
My understanding is that we can, with the Provincial Grand Master's permission, and certainly regalia is worn at memorial services, it's worn in cathedral services, it's worn for Remembrance Day, the various parades that happen up and down the country there. I don't think it should become something which is everyday commonplace. Everywhere you look, there's somebody in full Masonic regalia wandering about. But I think for very special occasions and ones where it's appropriate and it's worn with a good reason and solemnly, it's dignified and it serves a purpose, then we certainly shouldn't be afraid of wearing it and should be happy to be seen in it. The public, they have a slightly different view on this, because we looked at our traditional dress, and actually youngsters thoroughly like dressing up to go out in the evenings. They're not put off by either suit and tie dress code. They're not put off by sort of Masonic morning dress code. But actually, if you show them a picture of us in regalia, it goes back to that thing I was talking about earlier about different audiences, different languages. We're all used to it because I've seen people dressed like that for 20 years. However, if I'd seen a load of people dressed like that, 25 years ago, and said, "Do you want to be one of them?" Not sure what my answer would have been. So I think you've got to be a little bit careful. We can either normalize it and get everybody used to for people seeing us in it, or we can keep it as something special for within our ceremonies. And I think, on balance, if it's not serving a really useful purpose, I prefer the latter.
Now, we've been having a wonderful conversation for nearly 45 minutes, which has been brilliant. I can't believe how quickly it's gone, David. So thank you ever so much indeed for being our first victim. Sorry, our first guest on Solomon Live. A couple more things I'd like to know. Celebration. So this has been a difficult time for everybody. Is there any celebration planned for the future where we can all come together, and of course equally remember those who've sadly passed away?
There is. So certainly for our June quarterly communication, we will be doing an act of remembrance within that to remember those people who we have lost and who the nation has lost to COVID. And there are a number of different celebrations which are planned throughout the Constitution, which provinces are in charge of doing something local. That's being coordinated through the Membership Working Party of the Board at provincial level. And I think it's really important that when we come out the other side and we're able to return to normal, we do both of those things. We remember those people that we have lost and the lives that they had and the good that they did as individuals, for the families, for their communities. But we also look forward to getting back to normal and doing what we all enjoy. And we have a really good shindig to celebrate that we're able to do that again after so long. And I think both of those elements are really important. And
I think we'll all look forward to that, won't we? For many reasons. Finally, David, many of us, well, not many, all of us are looking forward to getting back to our lodges, seeing our friends again, wearing that regalia. The government roadmap seems to be pointing towards that happening. So when you look at the future of Freemasonry in the next 5 or 10 years, how do you see that? How do you see that future looking?
I'd like Freemasonry to become much more of a force for good in society. I'd like to diversify our lodges so that individual interests are catered for, by which I mean that for those members who want to use Freemasonry primarily as a social club or a dining society, there are lodges which can accommodate that. But similarly, for those lodges that want to actually get out there and do something within the community and be much more active, I think there should be lodges that should be able to do that as well. People who want to actually put into practice the fundamental teachings that we learn within those ceremonies to improve yourself, to look after those less fortunate, and to remember that you've got one life, live it well. And those lessons haven't changed in 3 centuries or longer. They're just as important today as they have been throughout time. And I would like us to see us really using them and bringing them forward to let people know who Freemasons are and what we do.
David, it has been an absolute privilege to talk to you for the last 45 minutes or so. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Have you enjoyed it, sir?
Very much, yes. It's it's a great shame that I am still in a bedroom talking to a pixelated screen. I love to do these things live, but that having been said, thank you very much indeed for having me.
Dr. David Staples, Grand Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of the United Grand Lodge of England, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Solomon Live. And our next Solomon Live will ask about women's Freemasonry. We're delighted that Most Worshipful Brother Christine Chapman, Grand Master of the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons, also known as Freemasonry for Women, will be joining us. Same time as this evening, 7:30. Put that in your diary, ladies and gentlemen and brethren. That will be Tuesday, the 4th of May. Details and booking links will be sent out later this week. And if you haven't already done so, please make sure you register for Solomon. We're very easy to find, solomon.ugle.org.uk, full of papers and videos for your daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. I can't recommend it enough. It's absolutely brilliant. Until then, thank you for joining us on our first Solomon Live, and we'll see you very, very soon.
Take care.